Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast, where we navigate our political and cultural divides with a chaser of civility. We invite you to grab your favorite beverage and join us as we explore our differences and build bridges across our divisions. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today we have Elizabeth Weiss with us. Elizabeth, it's good to see you here. We're looking forward to having a conversation with you, a lot to talk about. Before we do, I know that you're in an earlier time zone and we are recording on a Monday. I don't know if you brought a drink to this table, but do you have anything in your cup?
Unfortunately, I only have water.
That's completely acceptable. I'm feeling a little bit, I'm doing something new, David, and it is a Monday. I am doing a cucumber mojito.
Ooh, very nice. I like
so that. I'll tell you how that goes. What about you? Anything in your cup?
Yeah, I have a, oh, you don't see that very well. I have a shot of rum in my Diet Coke.
In your Diet Coke.
Yeah, so it's gonna, it's gonna be good.
That's better. Elizabeth, sometimes he comes to the table with his McDonald's Diet Coke, and we're always like,
classy, very classy.
That's what it's all about, right? I mean, So Elizabeth, I think just the first question for you is just a little introduction of yourself. We know that you are a professor at San Jose, and you are an anthropologist, and you've recently come up against the system, if you will. And so why don't we just start with who you are and what you're doing right now, and then David and I'll jump in and pepper with you with a ton of more questions.
Sounds good to me. So I'm Professor Elizabeth Weiss. I'm a physical anthropologist. I study skeletal remains. And in the last couple of years, I've kind of been fighting a cancel culture campaign against my work, and specifically against my work that includes writing about the importance of preservation of the skeletal remains. So I have basically two types of work I do, in the sense. One is literally the study of skeletal remains, and it might be as simple as looking at a bump on the head and trying to explain that, or it might be more demographic type studies. But and then I have what I consider my other line of writings, which include my writings on repatriation, and how I feel that I think that skeletal collections are too important to be lost to arguments of creation myths put forth by Native American tribes and those who support them. And so I've written about repatriation and reburial laws since 2004, definitely. And in 2020, my book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, was published by the University of Florida Press. And my co-author, James W. Springer, is a retired attorney. And so he wrote all the difficult legal parts, and I wrote all the fun parts about how you study skeletal remains and what you can learn from them. After the publication of this book, there was a campaign to try to get it banned, or at least removed from libraries and open access availability. This led to a letter to my publisher, which I think something like 900 people signed to try to argue that my book should be banned. And that kind of led to a cascading effect of different waves of the cancel campaign. One of them was I gave a talk at the Society for American Archeology, and it was about not using creation myths to make repatriation claims. And that talk was called Hate Speech. The activists tried to get it deplatformed. It did play during the one play of it, the first initial playing, but they did remove it from the platform, the Society for American Archeology platform. And just the other day, I got a letter from the Society for American Archaeologists Association that was sent out to all the members about a task force that they had created because of the Weiss Springer affair, where they're trying to figure out how to keep people like me off of their program, including what limits of free speech that they should engage in. So that was another aspect of it. Another factor was my university had taken issue with a photo that I posted on Twitter. This was not, this photo with me holding a skull is not very different from the many photos that they actually even asked me to pose for, including on Provost's promotional magazine ones. But their reaction to this photo ended up including literally locking me out of the curation facility where the skeletal remains are, and posting a whole new set of protocols for access, including protocols that I would say are sexist, such as menstruating women are not allowed to hold or handle skeletal remains. And you must wear proper attire, whatever that means, and that usually is aimed at women. I'm suing the university for retaliatory action. I'm with Pacific Legal Foundation, who are working on it with me, mainly as a free speech issue. I don't have any problems with people disagreeing with me. I have worked with people who are for repatriation. That's, this is a debate to be had, and how old the remains should be or how tight the link should be to a modern tribe is a debate to be had. But it appears that a lot of the repatriation activists don't want a debate, and they rather engage in a cancel culture campaign, which is what has been happening.
Yeah, can you explain what repatriation is? I listened to you, by the way, on Michael Shermer. I was unbelievably moved by what you've gone through and your story, and I thought it sort of takes it to a new level. So explain what that is.
So repatriation is I would split it into two things, to laws and an ideology. The laws are like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and a California version of it called CalNAGPRA. And these are laws that require federally funded institutions or government funded institutions to look at what skeletal collections they have and artifact collections they have in their facilities, and determine whether there's any link to modern people from the past people. And if there are, to give the skeletal remains and artifacts to the modern tribes. These links can be as strong as, genetic links, right? And literally someone who is, great grandson, for example. But they can be as nebulous as it's our oral tradition and our creation myths that we've been here from the dawn of time, and therefore any skeleton found on this land should be linked to our tribe. So it's a huge range. And over the years, since the passing of these laws, the requirement for affiliation or for a link has become more broadly defined, right? So the link, it can be weaker and weaker. And so what happens with repatriation is that the remains, the collections, are given to a modern tribe, and those tribes have the choice to either curate themselves, request for curation, or for reburial. And most of the time they will engage in reburial.
And so this tribe that you're dealing with the skull, insist that it has specific ritual requirements that prevent a menstruating woman from being taken a picture with that skull?
It's a little bit kind of blurred lines, so to speak, in the sense of there are multiple tribes who are in consultation with the NAGPRA and coordinator and the tribal liaison who work for the university. I don't know which tribe is claiming that this discrimination is part of their culture. The tribe where the collection I work with is called the Ryan Mound. And the most likely descendants, although there's clear evidence that the tribe changed over the collection, is not just one people. It spans 2,000 years, and there definitely looked like there was invasions in that area. But the most likely descendants, at least for the later part of the collections, are the Muwekma Ohlone. And prior to this cancel culture campaign, they always said that they were for research. They never mentioned anything about menstruating women or appropriate attire. So it makes me question when these rituals became important. Is it a different tribe who's making this request? And if so, then why would that be important for this collection? And if it's not, why was it never mentioned beforehand? So I think that one of the problems is that a lot of the cultural traditions that are claimed are not written down. Of course, prehistory is not written down, so we don't know what the past people really thought. And therefore, it gives a lot of leeway to just literally use these kind of rules to discriminate against people.
I've got so many deeper questions for you, but a more superficial question. In your realm of work, when did this really become an issue? This repatriation, this activism around it. I mean, can you put a timeline on when it became? I mean, I'm sure that we've always talked about whose bones are what, from the end of time, but where it became something that bordered on cancellation. When did you notice that?
I think it's been quite a while. The federal law, NAGPRA, passed in 1990. So one of the reasons why we published the book in 2020 was because it was the 30th year anniversary. Okay. But I think initially there was hopes that remains that were not clearly affiliated to modern tribes would be preserved and could be continued to study. Then about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, the definition for what is affiliated and not loosened, or was tried to loosen to just geographical location, as opposed to a more strict definition. I think that it wasn't really, there had always been perhaps kind of if you're not for repatriation, there were always activists who might attack you. And when I first wrote about repatriation back in like 2002 to 2004, I would get some nasty emails, but it was minor. And there was still a strong contingent of vocal anthropologists and archaeologists who recognized that that repatriation and reburial was a problem for the science. I don't think that it became as really vitriolic and as a cancel culture campaign until the last maybe 5 years, maybe even more recent. But I think it's definitely taken an uptick recently. Certain other aspects, I said that you can think of repatriation as the laws and the ideology. And the ideology of repatriation is basically a postmodern ideology that argues that, in addition to the actual act of giving back collections, it argues that the science should be decolonized, that who's telling the story is more important than if the story is correct. And I think this is actually a fairly recent aspect or a fairly recent vocal aspect of the repatriation issue. So for example, saying that, people who are not Indigenous shouldn't even be speaking about the stories or shouldn't try to tell the story of the past, I think is more recent.
So what would a decolonized story of a skull be like compared to just a plain old colonized version of a skull?
I think a decolonized story of the skull might include trying to argue that this individual was perhaps a shaman with no evidence of it, or that all ancestors were valued, or that erasing information that is unflattering, like evidence of violence, things like that. That the past peoples were far healthier prior to contact with the Europeans. So pretty much framing the story as, wherever you can, if there were European people involved, things went bad, and wherever you can, drawing an image of things were so good beforehand.
Right. So I have a larger conceptual question to ask you. Anthropology is the study of human development and societal development, which is fascinating. Yet it seems to me that it inherently bumps up against this idea that all human differences can be explained by systemic factors in the here and now, or in the past. And I'm wondering how anthropology itself in this ideological environment is not being canceled. How is that not inherently problematic in this ideological moment? And are your colleagues, maybe I'm extending are your colleagues feeling this just because of the very nature of the endeavor?
I do think that there is an attempt to cancel anthropology in the traditional sense of, an objective, an attempt for an objective knowledge-based way to understand both culture and human biology, so human evolution. I think that what's happened is many anthropologists have taken a different road, and that is to reframe all the questions in, basically a decolonized version, or looking at it in a way of how can we turn this into social justice action, and so they're framing it in with different paradigms, so to speak. I'm not against people deciding to do that, but I don't think that people should feel that they have to do that. Recently, I was interviewed for American Archeology magazine, and I was the one non-repatriationist interviewed, and one of the things is that a lot of them spoke about our colonialist past, our racist past, and so forth, and trying to say, we have to get away from this as anthropologists, as opposed to focusing on some of the good aspects of our past. Right? And anthropologists were also key in understanding modern human variation in a way that was not racist, right? So some of them literally testified at civil rights hearings, and so. But in addition to how it's being framed, I also think that if somebody just wants to study the shape of arrowheads and how they change through time and how that maybe is a technical question, they should feel free to do that. I don't think every study needs to be defined in social justice terms. I think that there is a place for just inquiry, scientific inquiry for knowledge's sake. And if we lose that, I think that that's a very sad thing to lose.
You know, you mentioned this, I've heard you speak, and I think you even touched on this now. But in some of the bones that you study, there isn't a clear connection necessarily with a tribe. Like, I mean, they could be 100 years old, they could be 2,000 years old, right? So just make sure that I understand what you're saying. If the bones are found on a certain land and a certain group of people can claim that land, even if it doesn't necessarily, if you were able to do the study to look at the bones and find out that they were from 1,000 years ago, that's not even part of the dialogue. Did I hear you right?
Right. So one of the things that happened in about 2010 is that the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act there was talk about modifying it. And there's basically the modification included saying, you know, if there's a geographical link in the sense of there's a modern tribe that lives in that place, any skeletal remains found in that area could be linked to that without any further evidence. So that's one of those aspects where you could make you know, the argument that they're just basing it on geography.
Right.
Now, most of the time, even before that was proposed, the tribal connections were nebulous. And a lot of times they were based on oral traditions. A lot of times they were based on myths. And so, you know, there's a difference between like oral histories and oral myths. And so histories are more likely not to contain like creation stories of things that could not have happened. Whereas oral myths, you know, can have all sorts of weird things like talking ravens and coyotes on rowboats, you know, to make the claim, oh, this coyote who is, you know, one of our gods was rowing down the Mississippi, and therefore this links us to the Mississippi area, you know, these kinds of things. So I think that this is very problematic from a scientific perspective. But the other thing is the tribes themselves have changed. I just finished reading Without Reservation, which is about tribes in Connecticut, Native American tribes in Connecticut, and how they were manufactured practically. In literally historic times, so like in the 1980s, not even talking about that long ago. And people move around all the time. They have, and they, you know, they will continue to do so. And so geography is a poor link. There's the skeletal collection that I've spent most of my career studying, and I've studied many skeletal collections, but this is the main one, the Ryan Mound. It has a span of over 2,000 years, and the earliest people definitely look different skeletally than the latest people. Now, some people would argue, you know, well, DNA can resolve this, but with DNA studies, you do not test every skeleton. And the other thing is, there are no tribal markers for DNA. There are tribal markers for population groups like Native Americans. But, you know, the Muwekma Ohlone don't have their own tribal DNA marker. So it's a matter of degree. One of the most famous skeletons that have been reburied is Kennewick Man, the 8,000-plus-year-old skeleton found in Kennewick, Washington. And it, you know, his discovery led to a huge row and lawsuit to try to prevent repatriation. And the scientists in the end were able to study him. Great book on Kennewick Man, I think one of the editors is Douglas Owsley, came out in 2014. And basically, they did DNA studies and they found that he had some genetic similarities to the Colville tribe, who was one of the tribes that argued for his repatriation and a link. But Kennewick man also had, genetic similarities to some European groups. It was actually most similar to South American Native Americans. So there's a question like, had they tested all of the Native Americans in North America, so all tribes, would Colville still have been the most similar of the Native Americans? Because, and I'm saying North Native Americans, because there were very few tested. And what about those South American Native Americans? Why was he so similar to them? Many questions still arose, but basically the DNA evidence was used to rebury Kennewick man because there was any link between one of the tribes who tried to claim him and the genetics. So I think that it's far more nuanced than just, it's not the Maury Povich show with a paternity test, right? It's far more nuanced than that.
So let me ask you, I want to go back to you being barred from being able to even enter that area. What is the university really defending this this idea that it cannot allow menstruating women in? Isn't that sexist on its face? Isn't it, like, wouldn't that violate the law, or does somehow these tribal claims, do they supersede anti-discrimination law? I'm just trying to understand legally where they even, why some legal advisor didn't whisper in the ear of the president of the university and say, this is absurd. She has every right to examine this. You can't prevent her from coming in because she's a woman.
It's quite amazing that it hasn't been challenged. And the menstruating taboo is actually fairly widespread in archaeology. It's in field schools. UC Berkeley has cooperated with certain tribes in field schools, and they've literally required females who are menstruating not to be in the field with others. And it goes beyond just access to the skeletal remains and handling the bones. They're not allowed to be near the elders, the tribal elders. So they're literally being shunned, isolated. I think this is discriminatory. I think that somebody's going to have to pick up, this line and say, this is not okay. Who that will be, I don't know. I don't know if, I've written a lot about it. I think that we'll see what happens with my own free speech case. One of the aspects is that when they decided to lock me out, they tried to make it look like, well, we're just following the law. We're just following CalNAGPRA, and we're tightening up our rules. But this was really right after the attack on me about an op-ed I wrote that was critical of these laws, and the photo of me with holding the skull. So even, I think that part of this is, discrimination against females in general, and I think part of it is personal.
Are there other women colleagues who are allowed to still go in?
Yes. The
on what basis then?
Excuse me?
On what basis can they go in and not you?
Basically, they're considered the tribal liaison and the NAGPRA coordinator are both women. I suspect that they can't go in when they're menstruating. How they determine that is beyond. I think that this is like, it's so absurd that this would even be allowed as a question. I just don't even, and these women, I'm sure, consider themselves feminists. When I asked this question in my class, my graduate class, the students were like, well, it's no big deal if I can't hold skeletal remains while I'm menstruating. I'm like, but isn't this against women? Like, well, it's indigenous people's right, and I'm not sure it is. Like I say, I think there is something, this is something that should be challenged.
Because if it was any other modern religion, I think that we would hear a huge outcry.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm very cynical, but I think that it's basically, if it's a Western religion, then there would be outcry. But if it's not a Western religion, there would be no outcry. I know, for example, there's quite a few articles on the problem with National Hijab Day, and our university celebrates that. And tomorrow is International Women's Day, and this is Women's History Month. And the library, the San Jose Library, has decided on some of their posters to take the E out of women and replace it with an X. So I think that there is also well, if it's Western and maybe what they would consider conservative, it's not okay. But if it's non-Western and what they consider liberal, then it is okay.
I've got a question on that. So we're talking about these activists, and you've already said that it's a fairly new phenomenon. Who are most of these activists truly like Native people concerned about their history, or is it another group of people who are making noise because the time is right?
I think it's a mix. I would say a lot of the people who have been very critical of me have been a mix. I do get some Native Americans who have written op-eds against me, or have tweeted against me and so forth. But many of them are what we would maybe consider allies. It's a term that is is very commonly used. And I think that it's also a mix between those who are university professors and students, and activists who are not in anthropology. So I do think that it's quite a wide range. Some interesting trends I've noticed is that they're mostly women. I'm not sure why, but they're mostly women. And they do veer on the younger side, I would say. I think those are the two trends that I see. But I would say that the people who've emailed me their support, or who are supportive of me, are a very diverse group, including professors and students. But also, I get emails from Native Americans who are against this because they want to know Native American prehistory accurately and not just based on myths. I get emails from laypersons who are just interested in anthropology. So I get a very broad mix of supportive emails and tweets as well.
Yeah, wow. So is the university trying to get rid of you?
I don't know. They probably would love to get rid of me. I will not, I have no plans on resigning. I have no plans.
Are you tenured, right?
I'm tenured and I'm full professor. So I do not have any plans on resigning. I really don't know if what they would most like to do is fire me, or just have me slink in the corner and continue to do what I did in the past. It's kind of interesting because I really thought before all this happened that the university was very protective of academic freedom, and that my department was as well. Even though I had written about repatriation for many years and been a vocal critic of it, giving talks even at the provost's office level and at the college level, nobody, was hostile. I knew some people disagreed with me, but there wasn't a hostility until really 2020 or maybe even 2019. So until my book came out and the negative attention, I think that they knew exactly my perspective. As long as they thought it was good for the public image, they had no problem with it. They're like, oh yes, we love diversity of thought. As soon as somebody said, well, this is racist and anti-indigenous, they were like, oh no, we don't like this. So I think that they basically lost their backbone.
Do you have any sense of what the dynamic is at the university level, among the board of trustees, among the president? Do you have any sense that there are specific people that have turned on you since this, or is this just something? Is it just a sort of a black box?
I know that in my department level, I think that they've turned on me. My chair, I would say, and I would say at the college level, the dean. The dean hosted my chair at a talk called, which they titled, "What to Do When Your Tenured Colleague is Branded a Racist." And basically, I would say what to do when your tenured colleague is branded as a racist, to stick up for their academic freedom and be a supportive colleague. But their answer was basically to try to keep resources away from them and try to isolate that person as much as possible, which is what they've been trying to do. I think the provost has been quite vocal against my position. He wrote a letter that he sent out to the whole university against my photo of me holding a skull. And I think the president as well was very active in the active removal of me of my access to resources. So so I think it does go as high as the president.
I still don't get it. I'm like, okay, so you're in this field, anthropology. I'm just, maybe this is just next level, but you're in this field, anthropology, that studies human development, and you're in a department where there are other people like you who have been trained in the same scientific method that you have, and these are people who are that as soon as there was some controversy around you holding a skull and around your support for repatriation, they immediately folded to that pressure, and they're willing to do that at the expense of their own scientific area. I just don't understand.
I think there's another wrinkle in this, and that is that I'm the only physical anthropologist in the department. So we have 2 archaeologists and the rest are cultural anthropologists. So I think that is the other wrinkle, that their resources are not being affected. I don't think that they would.
What do you mean their research? In other words, okay, because they're not worried about having access to skulls.
Yes, they don't do research on skeletal remains. I think they wouldn't classify themselves as scientists, at least not the cultural anthropologists. The skeletal collection that I'm now working on, which is not Native American, which is from Tunisia, it's a Carthaginian collection. And, one of the things that the department wanted to do was take away my ability to take photographs of even non-Native American skeletal collections. And one of my colleagues asked whether I had permission from these people to take photos. And I'm like, what do you mean permission from these people? These people are dead and have been dead for hundreds of years. And she's like, well, beforehand, did you get permission? And I said, did they write anything about photographs in their documents? Like, there wasn't even a thing such as a camera, and it's this level of absurdity. And I think that it's a kind of over the top political correctness that is trying to kowtow to, how can we be as correct as possible, kowtow to indigenous rights, even when it has nothing to do with their remains, such as the Carthaginians.
Political overcorrection.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know that in your book, you mentioned this, erasing the past, but, for our listeners, what is it that we're actually losing as a result of this? There's so much that I know that I've heard you speak about. I mean, what are we losing when this is the norm?
Well, I think we're losing our best ability to understand what happened before written language. So before people started writing. So we're losing our ability, for example, to understand disease patterns, what people were literally doing day-to-day activities, the level of trauma and violence. So and some of these things are, portray these people in a complex manner. For example, the Ryan Mound had quite a bit of evidence that violence occurred, including obsidian flakes and backbones and broken noses and so forth. And yet almost all the children's bones had no evidence of violence, suggesting that they protected their children from violent encounters. Factors like, looking at when care of elderly started. So really reconstructing what past people's lives were like. We also lose the ability to learn about skeletal anatomy and bone biology. There's still a lot of stuff we don't know about bone biology that is pretty basic. There's more to learn. One of the things I do is I look at arthritis patterns, and I found that, comparing past populations' arthritis patterns to modern populations' arthritis patterns, different joints are affected. And those different joints are more affected because in the past, arthritis was more likely linked to overuse and sometimes trauma. And in the present, it's more tightly linked with old age and lifestyle things like obesity, right? So understanding these kind of factors. The other thing is we lose ability to use our information about understanding skeletal remains to help present day people. Forensic anthropologists learn on skeletal collections. They learn how to determine cause of death, whether the bones were male or female, the age of the skeleton. Even recently, I did a study on what we call the epiphyseal lines, which indicate whether somebody is still growing or not, so growth plate lines, and showed that when somebody stops growing, when they're an adult, some of these lines can appear in an X-ray for decades later, like into your 80s. And this shows that when looking at the line is not evidence that the fusion just occurred recently. This helps us as forensic anthropologists say, well, then that is not a good age indicator, and not erroneously say someone was young when they were not. Same thing with sutures on the skull are now not considered good age indicators, in part because anthropologists, forensic anthropologists, biological anthropologists figured this out using skeletal remains. So I think that, and we're losing the way to understand the past, but we're also losing collections that help us understand how best to use the skeleton for the present as well.
Are any of the physical anthropologists in other universities that you know, are they coming out to defend you?
Some of them have, and I do have people who've been supportive. There's a huge culture of fear. I've had people reach out to me, such as state archaeologists who work on sites like construction sites when to ensure that if there's some remains or artifacts discovered, that they are not just bulldozed, that they are actually removed and preserved. And most of the collections in the US were considered, were what we consider salvage collections, collections that were not excavated just for scientific knowledge, but were excavated because of construction. Many of these archaeologists and anthropologists have, who have reached out to me, have said that they support me, but are scared to do so because they're worried that they're going to lose their jobs. So I do think that there's a very big culture of fear. And, I think that silences people, and they might send me an email, say, but don't release my name, but they're not writing, letters to my university or even to the newspapers saying I support her, her work.
I'm familiar with that ritual. Yeah.
Yeah.
David can speak to it.
Yeah. It's pretty much a universal reaction, I think. Yeah. So what's next for you? How you have this lawsuit out there. How are you going to continue to fight against repatriation? Are you going to continue to write op-eds? Is there anything holding you back now because of your lawsuit, or because you're under threat? In some ways that, I mean, you have tenure, that's great, but a university that really wants to fire somebody can still put a lot of pressure on them if they try. What's your next move?
My next move is basically to keep on keeping on. I am engaged in looking at that Carthaginian collection, and I do have plans for some research on that. I am attempting to get the X-rays that have been taken of the Native American collections. Unfortunately, the university is claiming that those X-rays also fall under NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA. They do not. And the tribes have said that they want the X-rays so that they can burn them. This is one of my big battles that I'm hoping to get access to those X-rays.
Why would they want to burn an X-ray? I'm not sure I understand, because it's not like that's an original artifact. Is it that they're scared that you're going to use these wicked Western scientific methods to tell something to the public that they don't want to hear? Is that it? Counter narrative in a way?
I don't know why. I don't know if that's part of their narrative. I think it is because they are against me studying the remains at all. And so it is personal. I've taken X-rays of these remains before, and others, and my students have. The Mwekma Ohlone have never complained about X-rays before. I've never heard of another tribe complaining about X-rays. So I'm not sure whether this is just a straight out retaliation. We know she's against repatriation. She's spoken up against it, and we want to get her, and therefore we know she wants the X-rays, and we won't give them. So it's hard to say, but I think that and we'll see where that ends up. I do think that that's an important aspect to fight for. X-rays are very revealing. They can be used to look at, of course, bone density. They can be used to look at what we call Harris lines, which are indicators of somebody, if somebody had stress during childhood and stopped growing for a period. So in a sense, they are useful, and I would use them for research. I also plan to continue to write about the problems of repatriation and the problems of the laws. I'm in the midst of writing some articles now. And, you know, I don't think that this, even if skeletal remains become less and less available and more are repatriated, the battle will not be over for two reasons. One is because new remains may be discovered. And if we can prevent repatriation and reburial, maybe new collections will be a thing, right? Will arise. But then the other thing is moving goalposts of what the repatriation ideologists and the activists with this ideology will literally ruin anthropology in the study of skeletal remains and of the study of the past. So, you know, today it's skeletal remains, tomorrow it's X-rays. Actually, today it's X-rays, right? Next, do they want literally the numbers from what we've taken or photographs that have been used at site? I don't think that they will be satisfied with just the skeletal collections, and that's another reason to continue the fight.
Right. I have to ask one more thing, and then Jen, you take
I got only one more. You go.
Okay. So I want to make sure I got this correctly, because it seems to me so next level absurd that it's hard for me to, like, if I'm talking to my friend, okay, on the phone, and I'm going to say, I talked to this anthropologist and she faced a cancellation campaign because she was photographed with a skull in her hand, okay? Now, and it's almost funny to say, now, I'm trying to understand what the president of your university or the dean or somebody else would say why they think that you should face consequences for taking a photograph with that. So can you express what your best representation of their argument is?
I think they would say that they would argue that it's not respectful because of the spirit or the souls of these individuals and the indigenous beliefs that these remains should be reburied. There was,
even though you've taken a lot of photographs in the past with skulls, including being pictured on various university magazines, it was okay then, but now somehow the goalpost changed, and now you should be shamed out of your field.
Yeah, I think that I do think that the goalposts have changed, but I also think that there are still plenty of photos like this taken every day, posted on the internet with no complaints. And I think part of it is that they know that I'm against repatriation, that I'm critical of creation myths, and that I'm not supportive of just accepting all indigenous oral traditions or oral myths for repatriation. And I'm also critical of what I would consider hypocritical thinking, such as it's perfectly fine to discriminate against women when it's an indigenous group, but it's not perfectly fine if it's not an indigenous group, a Christian group, Western Christian group. So I think that these are the reasons why I'm facing cancel culture, as opposed to somebody else who's holding the skull. There was, there's, issues about whether I was doing it in a disrespectful manner. I personally would say that I have a great deal of respect for skeletal collections because I know what they can tell us. And I would never, handle them in a way that they could damage them. I would never, do something to them that would make them not be able to be studied by the next generation. I do have an incredible amount of respect for these skeletal remains. I do not believe that they hold any souls. I do not believe in spirituality. These are not my beliefs. But I also think that there was a big deal made about the language I used along with the tweet, along with the photo, which said, so happy to be back with old friends. And they said, oh, this term of friends, she's making a joke of it. And I would say that there's nothing joking about saying friends, even old friends. And when I had tweeted that, my thoughts were, one thing is I was happy to be back with the skeletal collection. This was after 17 months of COVID. I had literally, the day before we went to remote, I was literally in the collection room doing curational duties. So I was happy to be back. And I think that anybody who looks at that photo sees a genuine smile. But the other thing is, the term friends is something that we use all the time as a matter of admiration and respect.
Yes, of course.
But I know there are friends of the past, friends of the library, friends of the forest. That's what I was aiming at, right?
So this is my last question for you. And in this quest for diversity, if you will, and what we've already mentioned, we've kind of overcorrected in a way. We've done a disservice almost to our humanity, right? And what you're studying, you've already mentioned like what the benefits of it are. Have you seen in this work kind of everything seems either or right now, you're either for repatriation or you're not. Is there kind of a both and thing? Like you take that bone and rebury it and I'll take this bone. Like, is that even a part of the discussion? I mean, I don't feel like anything in our world right now is both and. Everything is either or. But I mean, is there something there that we could present and say, hey, like, we get this, even though it might not even be your bones, but whatever, your land, here's a femur. I'll take the, ulna. I know I'm being flip, but
I think that for much of the history of repatriation laws, there was a lot of give and take. I think that anthropologists felt that this was an important compromise, and therefore they thought that having laws that would enable repatriation to affiliated tribes was an important step. And I think there still are people who believe in that compromise. What broke down the compromise in my mind is the fact that many of the skeletal remains could not be affiliated. And this upset people who really wanted to do repatriation. And therefore, their only option was to go for ways to loosen up the requirements for affiliation, to make it okay even when there isn't clear links, to say, yes, we'll still give you these skeletal remains back. I'm sure that there's a wide range of opinions on the repatriation issue. And I always say, I know I'm on the one end of the extreme. And, in all fairness, I feel that way about all skeletal remains, not just Native American skeletal remains. I've done research on European skeletal remains, on white American, Black American skeletal remains. So I've done research on non-Native American skeletal remains. And so for me, it's not about I don't want to I don't want the reburial of indigenous remains. I just think that the skeleton is so useful. And I think that we can learn so much that I do think it's a loss to rebury remains. I think funerals are a loss, Yeah, I have no plans of being buried. I have plans of donating my body to science. My parents are the same way. I realize that this is not everybody's way, but I think that somebody has to take my end of the extreme, and I decided to take that. I accept that there will be other people on the other end of the extreme. I respect their ability to argue for that. I would never try to shut them down, to silence them. Unfortunately, that's not the case with those who want to silence me. And I think that there's everything in between. So there are a lot of gray areas.
Yeah. Thank you. This is fascinating. I admire your courage in pushing forward here. We need wins here. So I'm so glad you're also taking up legally and standing up for free speech.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes to see what each of us is reading. Different news with different views. You can find us at holdmydrinkpodcast.com, all major podcast platforms, and on YouTube. Or subscribe on Substack at truthinbetween.substack.com so you never miss an issue. If you want to join our Discord community, drop us a line. And until next week, may your conversations be constructive and your divisions diminished. Cheers.